Hello everyone, welcome to a new episode of Youth Talk, a talented young Algerian writer whose debut novel, Sand Roses, has captivated readers. In a world where the beauty and challenges of the life in Algeria unfold through the eyes of compelling characters. With influences drawn from our own cultural heritage, Hamza's work speaks to universal struggles and triumphs. Today, we'll be learning all about Sand Roses with Hamza Koudri. First, I'd like to start by welcoming our guest. Hello, Hamza. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Hi, thank you so much for the invite. I'm so pleased to be here today.
You're welcome. I've read your book, and I loved it, Sand Roses. So let's start by talking about what inspired you to write this book. I think when you see the cover, you could tell it's about Algerian culture from the photo, from everything. We'll talk about the covers later, but could you tell us what inspired you to write the book?
Sure. So Sand Roses is a historical novel set in Algeria in the 1930s, and it speaks about these two sisters who were Oulad Nail dancers in a time where Algeria was under French occupation. And what inspired me to write it was actually I was just online when I saw this podcast that sort of mentioned in passing the Oulad Nail culture, and
the dancer culture,
especially so the dancing, and then I was surprised to learn about that because we know about Oulad Nail, we know about Boussaada a lot, but we, at least in my experience, we rarely talk about sort of this side of our history, and that put me on a little bit of a search and research spree when I went and did a lot of digging online, and the more I learned, the more I was fascinated with the whole culture. I think there was a time when it was very popular that attracted a lot of tourists from all over the world.
Just for the dancers?
Actually, a lot of people would come, to see the beauty of Boussaada. Boussaada has been always a very captivating and enchanting city.
Right.
But, so there would be tourists, but also artists, photographers, painters, filmmakers. There were a lot of films that were shot in Boussaada. And also these dancers would travel around the world. They would go with a circus, Circus Ammar, sort of like into Italy, but also to France. At one point, they traveled all the way to Chicago for the big fair in 1893, I think. And so for me, it was very fascinating to learn about this and also the different cultures and customs and everything that's different about their way of dressing, their way of life, their way of working, but also the jewelry and what it meant for them. And the more I learned about it, the more I saw also there was a little bit of a conflict between them and the French occupation. And then I saw an opportunity there to write, I think, a story. So to almost like excavate a little bit of that story of our, that part of our history.
Speaking of the culture and the dresses and the jewelry that they wore, I think we could see all of that in the cover of the book here. I think I have the Algerian edition.
Correct.
Right, the edition of the book that came out in Algeria, and you could see a woman from Oulad Nail who's wearing the traditional outfit, the traditional jewelry that I think we could still find in some parts of Algeria. They still wear these clothes, they still hold on to this culture. What made you choose this picture for the Algeria edition?
So this was part of also a lot of conversation when we were working with the first edition in the UK with the designer. There was a lot of, I think this was like version 20, but it was clear from the beginning that we wanted this lady on the picture because this was a picture taken, actually a Oulad Nail dancer. I think it was taken in the 1920s or even before that. If I'm not mistaken, it was one of the international magazines.
So it's a real Oulad Nail dancer.
Yes, and this was an old black and white picture that we took, and then we added a little bit of the background. There is a well, if you see in the background,
yes,
so to simplify the story. But also, we thought she, as a lady, also sort of like really represented the character, the main character, one of the main characters in the novel, who is Salima, because she has that defiant look. You can see her sort of like standing very defiantly, but also we added a little bit of detail. So she's wearing a bracelet, which is also, it was mostly sort of used for self-defense, and so it has a very important role to play in the novel. And then we added a little bit of detail around her makeup and the blood, and like I said, the well in the background. But we had a lot of fun working on that version, which was good.
Right, so this version looks very similar to the UK version, so I'm not going to show that one. But this one is also very special. I think it gives a look into the Algerian deserts, because you could see women walking around wearing these clothes till this day. So this is the traditional outfit, and you could see the dunes, you could see the the poems. I mean, this just says Algerian desert. How did you choose this one?
Yeah, and so this was with our sort of our publisher in Nigeria. This is the Nigerian edition, and I think they wanted to go with something a bit more mysterious. So you see the back of the woman and not so much the front.
Right.
And then so it gives you a little bit of intrigue, like, you know, who's this woman, why is she, or a little bit of mystery.
Yeah.
But then you can see also in the far there is a little bit of a town which you're assuming is Busada.
Right.
Yeah.
I've been to Busada a couple of times, and I think this could give somewhat of a visual of the city. Okay, so we talked about the covers. Which one is your favorite, by the way?
It's hard to tell. It's really hard to tell.
Give us an answer.
No, I mean, I think I worked a lot, sort of like, you know, I was really contributing to the first one, and it was the first cover that came out, so it's always going to be dear to me. But this one, the Nigerian, is colorful, and it's really attractive.
Very special. Yeah, it is. It looks very interesting.
Yeah.
So, Hamza, you told us the story behind Sand Roses and what inspired you to write it. How did you maybe include your personal experience with the Algerian heritage and Algerian culture, especially in the colonial times, with this book?
That's a very good question, and I, you know, sort of including my experience, I think mostly sort of, you know, my education and work has always been sort of in the field of culture, and also I studied sort of English literature and civilization, and so I've always been passionate about stories in general, right, and history especially, and I really enjoyed reading a lot of literature from around the world, especially what you learn about people's history. You know, so for example, you know, I can cite some people from, you know, Chimamanda Ngozi in Nigeria. I learned a little bit about, you know, for example, Turkey. There's Khalid Hosseini, who writes a lot about his own culture. And then also, you know, I think sort of like in parts of Africa, like South Africa, but also the UK. And so to me, when I set out to write Sand Roses, I really wanted it to be a historical fiction that is really rooted in a lot of research. So it took me years to finish that story, mostly because I spent a lot of time doing the research for it, just to make sure, you know, I was being accurate in terms of how I portray sort of these dancers, but also the culture in Busada. In the 1930s, it was a bit different. And so I also wanted it to be sort of a story written in English, but it tells a part of our history that even we don't know about. But also hopefully tell the world a little bit about it. Because when you read it
from an outsider's perspective, the truth could be a bit icky when it comes to Algerian desert and when it comes to Algerian culture. When it's written by an Algerian in English, I think it's the best representation.
Well, I hope so, because I think that was a challenge when I was finding some of the documentation that I was finding about the Red Nail culture was a bit sort of from an Orientalist point of view, and I didn't like that view. And I was hoping sort of to explore the voice from. That's why I also wrote. So they have three main characters, and two of them are two sisters who are the dancers, and I wanted to explore their voice a little bit more, hopefully to give it more of an authentic sort of touch. Yeah.
So it could feel like a real Algerian woman. Now, speaking of the three characters, how did you go about developing their characters? How did you go about their personal development throughout the story?
So that was a little bit of a tricky part, because so like I said, we have three main characters. Two of them are sisters who are the Red Nail dancers. So they were raised to sort of sing and dance and entertain.
To be entertainers.
Yes, exactly, to be entertainers. And so they and then at a certain age they're accompanied by their mother. So they come to Busada, where she introduces them to the cafes where they're going to be working, also to the jewelry place where they're going to make all of the beautiful jewelry. Right. And then they also have grown up with all of these dreams to become successful dancers. You know, they hear sort of stories of Hizia and other dancers who have traveled, right, and so they want to make it as successful dancers. So one of them wants to collect a dowry, sort of money, to go back to the village and marry her betrothed and raise the next generation of dancers.
So back then the woman had to pay the dowry.
It was very common, and not just in Algeria, in many places, most places.
I know, but that it was the case in Europe and some countries, but I didn't know it was the case in Algeria.
Actually, it was, and so in this case, it was the woman who would go and collect the dowry, and that, sort of a lot of the jewelry would go back and sort of to help raise a new family of.
Thank God those things changed.
Right, but really, I think the idea is when they come to Busada, they have these dreams of it's the city of joy, Busada. But then when they come, they're also faced with a lot of terrors and violence, especially considering
the conditions Algeria was in.
Exactly, yeah. And so they're targets too. Like people try to steal their jewelry, and so they have to defend themselves. And
this was when you mentioned the bracelet, you were like, it's a defense mechanism. Then I was like, oh, is it to protect themselves from theft or?
Exactly, because also, you know, they used to live in these quarters where there wasn't really a lot of, you know, there wasn't a bank, right? So then they couldn't leave the jewelry at home because somebody could steal them. So they would wear all of the jewelry, but then also because they worked, you know, they would sort of work at the cafe and walk back home, they were also easy targets for people, you know, thieves. Right. And so they had to defend themselves with these.
Using the bracelet. That's amazing. We should make more of those. So, Hamza, let's talk now culture. When it comes to the Algerian culture, you said that you wanted it to be very well represented in the story. But I think when you have an Algerian who's writing the book, there's an influence here that it's undeniable, that you can control the narrative, you could control the setting of the story. How did you navigate that?
So I think what I tried to do is to try to read, was trying to read sort of the history and the research around that, trying to read from sort of different perspectives, right? And then, you know, when you're portraying characters, I think the best way to do it is, you know, and try to be sort of authentic, is to make every character believable by having them sort of complex. You know, not everybody is perfect. So, like, you know, we have Salima and Fahima. They're, you know, you learn about their good qualities, but also learn about their you know, but the bad ones. You learn about how they make mistakes. They sort of they fight. Exactly, we make them human. And then also we have sort of one of the characters who's the French colonel. And then it was interesting to try to explore his view in terms of, like, why is he doing this? What was his background? How did he end up in Busada? And what is he trying to achieve? You also we have a painter, because we know, for example, there was a lot of, for example, Europeans who live in Algeria who were supporting the Algerian cause. So I tried to sort of deliver that through a painter. We all know of Etienne Dini, who used to live in Busada, and sort of integrated.
When I went to see some of his paintings that are still here, you could see the influence Busada had on him.
Exactly, yeah. And so I tried to sort of, you know, not really recreate him, but sort of like have somebody in his shadow.
Pay him homage.
Exactly, yeah, through another character.
That's amazing. So let's talk writing process. I'm sure this question would be of interest to a lot of young writers who want to put out their first books or novels. What is the process of writing a book like this like? Do you sit alone in a corner and start writing? Do you collect a bunch of information? Because it is set in a historical place where you have to have a lot of specific information about the area at the time, about the kind of people who lived there at the time, so you could make it more believable.
True, and yeah, it's definitely a lot of lonely time because, you know, nobody else will be writing the book for you. You have to do it yourself. Right. And in my case, most of the time it was like at 5 in the morning, wake up at 5 in the morning to actually write, which was helpful to me because, you know, your brain is still fresh and you're connected a little bit with the story. But really, I think they tell you there's two types of writers. There's a planner and there's a pantser, somebody who plans an outline and then follows it to the letter, and then somebody who just flies by the seat of their pants. And so basically sort of they just follow where the story takes them. I feel like I'm a little bit in the middle, but more towards a planner. I like to have an outline, but then I don't stick to it sort of rigidly. You know, if an idea comes up, a character sort of, you know, is more fun, I would sort of try to see where they go. So with Sand Roses, the key thing for me was the conflict, sort of that conflict, because, you know, we start with the sisters killing a French soldier in self-defense, right? And so, and, you know, they use the bracelet to do that, but also that's a conflict that was at the heart of the whole story, is how there is a clash between the French way of seeing things and the Algerian way, especially the red nail dancers, and so it sort of culminates into this little, you know, fight, which ends in him dying. And as they try to hide the body, they find themselves in deeper and deeper trouble. And so that was the heart of it. And so then I tried to build my way around this. Like, you know, I started with the scene, but how did they get to that scene? And what happens after that?
So you created a problem, and then you made them try to solve it.
I think that's it. Like, you know, you have a conflict at the center of it, and then it's actually, instead of starting, you know, slow and going up, we start like from the heart of the conflict, and then trying to go back in time, but then also forward to see what happens after, as they try to hide the body. And so by the time I actually started developing the chapters, I had probably 24 pages of an outline, maybe even more, where there's, you know, I have chapter by chapter what events happen each day. Exactly. Yeah.
That's amazing. So did you face any writer's block?
I don't know if it was writer's block per se, as much as I think a lot of the, especially at the beginning, I would get blocked in terms of historical accuracy. So, for example, I'd stop one day and say, "Oh, did they have electricity in Busada in 1930s?" And then so I have to spend 2 hours researching until I find it was, I think, 37. Or at one point to say, "Hey, what kind of transportation people used to travel from Algiers?" Yeah. And then that was so a lot of the research just to identify, just to me, because you don't want. Obviously, you don't, for example, want somebody in the 1930s to be using Instagram, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But then a little bit more details, small sort of to the accuracy of how did they use the light, for example.
Small details, but they could change the whole trajectory of the story.
Yeah, and so you don't want it to sound sort of off for somebody who's familiar with that part of the history. So I think that's where I got sort of stuck a lot. But then once I think past the first maybe 30 or 40%, it gets easier because then you've developed your world and you're having the characters move around and interact a little bit.
That's amazing. Any resources that you could recommend for maybe someone who's writing a similar book or a similar story?
Yeah, actually, to be honest, there's a lot of courses that you can take either in person or online. In my case, I took a lot of I was taking a creative writing class when I was doing a fellowship abroad, but then also I took a lot of courses online. So there is especially a book that I really liked was Save the Cat Writes a Novel.
Right.
It's based on another book called Save the Cat Writes a Script, which basically sort of lays on the different structures of any story you would want to write. And I think that was very helpful in terms of, because it focuses on the character and how you develop it. But then most of the writers that we know of, like Dan Brown or, for example, James Patterson, a lot of the famous writers would have some kind of, for example, Stephen King has written a book about writing, but other people who have maybe online courses that you can take. I go, for example, a lot on, online and take a lot of these courses, which are helpful for me just to see some of the process of the writing.
Yeah, sometimes it can even help with the blog. So can we talk symbolism now? Because when I held the book in my hand, I saw sand roses in big letters. So what did that maybe give as an imagery in your brain that you decided to write sand roses in big blocks of words, and then you had the picture for the rest of the cover? Did it symbolize something within the book? How did you choose this title?
So I think we're all familiar, I guess, especially in Algeria, we're familiar with the desert rose or the sand roses, which we find in the desert. Funny thing, I was just at a festival in Nairobi in Kenya, and I asked a question to an audience, and most people didn't know what sand rose is. And so I was lucky that I had one in my bag, so I just pulled it out and showed it to them. But we know, I think, what it is here in Algeria. And so in the book, there is a few references to the Oulad Nile dancers being like sand roses, and how it goes
a euphemism.
A euphemism, and I liked it because I think it's very accurate, because the Oulad Nile dances were they're very beautiful, they're very attractive, full of life, but also between the jewelry and the makeup, and you got the ostriches that go over their head, and I think so they're very attractive visually. But they go through so much trouble, they have to suffer through so much violence, and it makes them tough and very resistant and resilient. And so that's like a sand rose. Sand rose, it's beautiful like a rose, but it's not fragile, it's very solid. So we play a little bit with that image, and I thought that was very accurate.
That's very nice, I love it. Yeah. So could we talk about your audience or your readers? I think you have toured many countries, and you showed your book, you gave readings, you met a lot of your readers. How was the feedback?
Honestly, I've been really, really pleased, I think, with the feedback I've gotten so far. In Algeria, a lot of people have been super excited about an Algerian book written in English. I was just also at the Algerian festival in London, where I met some Algerians living there, but also some foreigners, and it was very exciting, I think, for people to be interacting with somebody who writes about Algeria in English. But also, I think when it was in Kenya and South Africa, that was also what I started to get is that was very much as a tool for us to be connecting with the rest of the continent through stories, and I thought that was very it really made me sort of happy to see that kind of interaction with other writers, but also with readers. It encouraged people to discover a little bit more about Algeria, to hear more, to ask questions, and I really loved that experience.
That's amazing. I think that's the point of writing a book about Algeria in English, to make Algeria more accessible to those who don't know much about it. So Hamza, I always like to ask people who write, or writers, any kind of writers, scripts, books, anything. Did any writer specifically influence your writing style that maybe you've drawn from?
you know, one of the best sort of pieces of advice that I usually get and I like to share too is you should read what you write and write what you read, enjoy reading. And so I enjoy reading historical fiction, and that's why I write historical fiction. And so so I always enjoy reading some of those historical fiction novels. One of my favorite ones are Ken Follett, who writes a lot about sort of medieval England, but also a little bit more World War Ones and World Wars One and Two. C.J. Sansom is another writer I really enjoy reading. And then from around the world, like I said, there's Chimamanda Ngozi from Nigeria. There's Elif Shafik, who writes also a little bit about her culture in Turkey. There's Khaled Hosseini. There's a lot of really, and then there's also a lot of modern ones. I've met some people who write really beautiful fiction. Somebody, Shubnam Khan from South Africa, she writes also really beautiful novels about her own culture.
So yeah, you're drawn from the writing style, people who love to write about their cultures, about their countries, and you did that for Algeria.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's amazing. I really look forward to see another book like this. So could we talk about your future projects, or do you have anything you maybe like to share with us first? We'd be the first to hear about it. Maybe a new book project, or writing a script out of this book to make it a movie.
I'd love for that to be a movie. But no, actually, I'm working on a sequel, what we call a standalone sequel. So like you don't really need to read the first book. But I'm writing a sequel to Sand Roses. It's standalone because it's set differently. We have some of the characters from the first book, but we moved to another city. We moved to Algiers. Right. 20 years later, we have new characters as well. But then it's set at the heart of the Battle of Algiers. So we're still exploring a little bit of the resistance. But that's something I am in the middle of writing. I'm also enjoying that. And then at the heart of it, in terms of themes, is more of like an identity and belonging. And so I'm having fun with that.
It looks amazing. I look forward to reading that one. So maybe there's a message that the readers can take away from your book, from Sand Roses. You told us that the euphemism that Sand Roses represents is the hardships that these beautiful dancers that we liked. They were very appealing visually, but they had to face a lot of hard circumstances. Maybe there's a message from the book that we could take?
So I don't know if there is a message per se as much. I think sort of some of my favorite experiences, especially here interacting with Algerian readers, is when somebody comes up and says, well, thanks to the book, I've been able to talk to my mother or my grandmother from Busada or other places like, you know, Biskra and Lagwat, who had similar cultures. And they would say, oh, we learned a lot about our own history, our own family history that we hadn't talked about before. And I think that gives me a lot of joy. And I think if the book helps people sort of discover this or other parts of our history roots even. And connect with the roots, I think, to be honest, I think that would be a very happy man.
That's amazing. I think the message that we can take from here is that Algeria has a beautiful culture, and we should start writing more about it in different languages to make it more accessible to those who don't speak Arabic and can't read Algerian books per se. So as a young writer, I'm sure that you feel a particular responsibility to address issues relevant to our generation or even past generations. Here you discussed a lot of things that happened during the Algerian Revolution for Freedom. So I think the theme in your books here is maybe that we could do more for our country, even on the cultural side, which you're doing for Algeria. Maybe do you feel like a responsibility as a young Algerian writer?
There is a heavy responsibility, but I think for sure, I think, you know, I read something online. I think, you know, somebody, I can't remember where I read it, but somebody said a writer who has nothing to say should have nothing to write.
Right.
And so I think some of the issues that are close to my heart are things that are, for example, migration or climate. And so I would love to, at one point in the future, go back and explore those. And because I think, you know, there is definitely a lot of stories to tell, but also a lot of lessons to learn. And I think that's the best way for us sort of to really connect with issues and be able to understand them, is to, because I think stories help us understand the human beings, because it's easy for us, you know, to talk about climate or...
They do, and they open up a lot of conversations as well.
Exactly, yeah, because I think you start, especially if you go to understand from a person's point of view and how they experience it, I think it changes your perspective. And so I'm hoping to explore a project around that, climate and migration. That's amazing.
I really look forward to reading more of your books. So any advice for our aspiring writers who are watching today and maybe have read your book and loved it and want to do something similar?
Well, I think, like we said at the beginning, there is no way around writing. Nobody's going to write the book for you. So I think, and to be honest, I think since I've published the book, I've had a lot of youth reach out either in person or online because they're writing their own project, or they've published maybe also a book in English or any other language, to be honest. I mean, English is good, but I think as long as you're comfortable in that language, that's very important. But really, I think the best, some of the best advice that I got was one, I think really, like I said, read what you enjoy writing and write what you enjoy reading, but also protect the process. You have to have some kind of process. Like I said, what works for me was 5 a.m., but it could be different for somebody else. But then also, I think just to keep writing, because there's no way around it. And then, I think also Stephen King says, you have to write through the bad stuff to get to the good stuff. So I'd like to share that as well. That's
a pretty amazing piece of advice. Thank you so much, Hamza. Any last words?
Well, I'd like to thank you for having me today, and I'd like to thank everybody who's watching, and hope they enjoy the novel and get to write their own stories, maybe.
My pleasure. We are looking forward to your future publications, and we shall be sharing them with the Youth Talk audience. Thank you, Hamza.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. See you in another episode.